Adjusting the volume there. So we have just passed the 100 days mark of this new government. I could entitle this video Starmer's 100 days, but I'll probably go with Labour's 100 days because it's not just a new Prime Minister, it's a totally new government. In British politics, we tend to, I would say, go through generational change. So we tend to go with the two big parties. That's been the way my whole lifetime for roughly a generation. I mean, looking at my lifetime, I was born in 1985, so that was the middle of the Thatcher government. And then there was a Tory government up to 1997, 12 years of my lifetime, that is. And then 13 years of New Labour, that is 1997 to 2010. And then 14 years of the Conservatives. There was the coalition government for the first 5 years of that, but yeah, Conservative majority government or Conservative-led government. So Tory, Labour, Tory, and now we're back to Labour. I wouldn't be surprised if Labour is in power for about a decade or thereabouts, because that is just the trajectory of the way British politics goes. Now, just before I get into this is not going to be absolutely comprehensive. I'm not going to cover absolutely everything. I am going to be using the Wikipedia article, Premiership of Keir Starmer, for assistance, just because it's convenient to do so. But before I get into that, before I go through some of the points of what this government's been like so far, I would just say that I really think every new government's going to have challenges in terms of fixing some of the damage from the previous government, or continuing to adopt some of the better policies. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that as they are, pushing through this stuff, it takes time. I think people have to understand that bills take time to go through Parliament. And if we look at, for example, the early prisoner release scheme, that's very much, I think, a result of the last government's failings on that issue. But because Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister and his government is in power, they get the heat for it. Clearly, no government's going to get everything right. Now, if you were to do a poll on the street right now, probably people would say they're disappointed by Labour. You hear this, I think, somewhat overused trope, worst Prime Minister ever. Frankly, we've heard that about every Prime Minister in recent years, specifically over the winter fuel allowance controversy. I think when you're in a position of power, when you're the leader of a country, it's going to be impossible to please everyone. You're going to have dissent. And there will definitely be things that Labour does that I don't like. I voted Labour, the reason being because the local candidate here campaigned strongly. He seems like a decent man. He seemed like a safe pair of hands. That does not mean that I endorse absolutely everything the Labour Party comes out with. I did think the Tories deserved to lose. I'll probably be making another video on the Tory leadership contest. It's now down to Jenrick and Badenoch, but I think the Tories deserve to lose. I think they got quite arrogant with being in power for so long. I think there was two big things that really turned me against the Tories particularly. One was the arrogance of power, this idea that I do think Tory ministers kind of thought it was one rule for them and another for everyone else. Partygate, to me, was not a trivial issue. It was a case of the man who set the rules and his cronies breaking the very rules that they set. I think that was, frankly, unforgivable. Tories said, "Oh, this is a big issue. It's being made into something bigger than it is." But I do think that was unforgivable double standards, and it's very much symbolic of the arrogance that Boris Johnson shows. That was one issue. Also, their attitude to the welfare thing. I do not like it. But this is an area where I made a video on this recently. I don't think Labour is any better. I think, unfortunately, I admit this is a side of me that's probably quite well on the left because I just don't like the sanction culture at the DWP. And I know there are people who abuse the system. That's wrong. It's wrong on taxpayers. But I'm tired of politicians, most politicians, not all of them, but most politicians, both Labour and the Conservative Party, talking about claimants like they're criminals. I just anyway, that's perhaps for another video. But yeah, I wanted to see an end of the Tories, so I don't regret voting Labour, and I would also say 100 days really isn't that much. Um, Starmer is still second only to Liz Truss in terms of premiership length. In about a few weeks, he'll surpass George Canning's 119 days. Then Viscount Godric, and he'll the longer he's in power, the longer he's in power. I'm going to cautiously say at this point, I predict Starmer will be in power for between 5 and 7 years, i.e., a roughly average length, or maybe slightly more than average, because I think people want stability. I think Labour will be keen to avoid the reshuffle of prime ministers that we saw under the Tories. So I think Starmer will be prime minister for a while, and that's not entirely a bad thing because we need some stability, frankly. I think the rotation of prime ministers, we had Theresa May 3 years, Boris Johnson 3 years, Liz Truss 49 days, Rishi Sunak just over a year and a half. I mean, that was ridiculous. 5 prime ministers in the space of a decade. It's far too many. So I think it's no bad thing if Starmer does stay in power for a while. He can be criticised. He'll make mistakes. He can be criticised. There's another thing about this 100 days thing. I don't think anything I'm going to talk about here will collapse the government. And it's kind of an advantage a new government has. The disadvantage is having to pick up the pieces from the previous government. But the advantage is whatever goes wrong in the very early days, generally people forget it by the time of the next general election, or at least if they haven't forgotten it, it's less of an issue. So, as an example, this Gifts hospitality controversy, the Labour Party freebies. 2024 Labour Party freebies controversy is how it's titled. I don't think, if this was coming at the end of a parliament, I think it has the potential to be a major scandal. But because it's at the beginning of a parliament and the beginning of this government, I don't think it's ground for a major scandal. That's not to condone it. I do think, particularly when Starmer has modelled himself as Mr. Rules, Labour needs to show that it's whiter than white, and of course they aren't. And the Tories will be jumping on this, a bit like they've been jumping on Starmer changing portraits in 10 Downing Street. Actually, the reason for that is, I know some women Tories have said, oh, this shows his attitude to women. Actually, he explained this. He said he doesn't like portraits in general. When he was at the CPS, he didn't like portraits of judges looking down on him. It is his house for as long as he is prime minister. Yes, it's state property, but it is still his house. I really don't think that's a major issue. As long as the paintings aren't damaged or they're looked after in storage, then I really don't think it's a. I mean, Barack Obama got similar sort of criticism. It's just I think it's overblown. I think the Tories are better focusing on actually being an effective opposition rather than what really is quite trivial stuff like that. Um, but like I say, this freebies thing, I don't think it's going to collapse the government, and I don't think it's going to. I mean, it's not going to be like the expenses scandal of the late 2000s. It's not going to balloon into that sort of scale of scandal. Um, so let's just look at some of the things Labour has done. Certainly, one of the most controversial is the early release of prisoners. Now, there's sort of a contradiction in Labour's crime and justice outlook because, on one hand, after the riots in England and Northern Ireland this summer, Labour was very quick to push for, harsh sentences, and some of the worst rioters got quite substantial time behind bars. That's where they are now. I welcome that because I think if you have drunk yobs basically threatening to burn people alive, no exaggeration, if you have racist thugs attacking minorities, um, the government has to be seen to be acting on that, just like David Cameron's government had to act after the England riots of 2011. Um, so I welcome the sentences that were handed down because we're not talking about trivial crimes here. We're talking about violent disorder. we're talking about violent racist attacks. Starmer was right to call out the far right, and some of his right-wing critics distorted his position on that. They said that he was branding everyone racist. He absolutely wasn't doing that. At no point has Keir Starmer said, for example, everyone who votes Reform is racist. But he was right to call out the far right. I will support him on that because there was a problem with that. Anyone who thinks that the summer's riots had no far right influence is deluded. They're just as bad as those who say that Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam or that should be brushed under the carpet. There is a problem in this country with far right extremism, no question about it. I mean, in my city, 2 Filipino nurses were attacked by the rioters. It's disgusting, abhorrent. So there's that on one hand, which I welcome. But then you have the release of prisoners, and people might justifiably ask, well, how come you've got prison space to put the rioters in there, but not for other criminals? Starmer said he was angered by the scenes of prisoners celebrating, but I do think there's some contradictions in Labour's crime policy. On one hand, Starmer and Cooper talk tough on crime, yet he has a prisons minister, James Timpson, who's come from the House of Lords. He's not an elected MP. He's a businessman. He's from the House of Lords. He's known for the Timpson key making business in Manchester. His attitude is very much of the liberal left. He actually said we punish too many people in this country. He's known for a scheme where he gets ex-offenders to do work in his factories. I don't dismiss that in of itself, but I do have a big problem with Timpson's attitude that we punish too many people. We're too fond of punishment. Now, what sort of message does that send out? And I think Keir Starmer was pretty tone deaf. When he was asked about this in his first press conference, he said, I'm very proud of that appointment. Well, it's a contradiction. You can't on one hand say we're being tough on crime, but I'm going to support my prisons minister who says we punish too many people. That is clearly a contradictory message. You're either tough on crime or you're not. I really think that James Timpson needs to speak to victims groups and tell them that we're too tough on crime. There may be some areas where people shouldn't be in prison for, certainly some financial crimes. But does James Timpson seriously think that violent thugs don't belong in prison? Does he seriously think that rapists don't belong in prison? Arsonists? Violent gang members? These are people the public have a right to be protected from. So I really have a big problem with his attitude that we punish too many people. I'd like to hear him quantify that. Because, if anything, there's far too many remorseless criminals that don't get the sentence they deserve. So for me, this is definitely one of the hottest domestic issues because I think that, I've said it before, I think young offenders are out of control in this country. And that's not entirely a new thing, but, they act with impunity. You see, I was going to say in Sunderland, but this could be replicated in almost any town in the country, right? Groups of predominantly young men, sometimes young women, but predominantly young men. This is teenage boys, guys in their early 20s, swaggering around, insulting members of the public. And if you dare confront them, you'll probably end up in hospital. That is an absolute disgrace. An absolute disgrace. And I blame our justice establishment for that. I think for too damn long, the approach to young offenders has been softly, softly. Because there's no deterrent. They don't fear justice. So I'd like to see Starmer and Cooper take that issue seriously. It's all very well saying they're going to tackle antisocial behaviour, but they need to put some weight to this. And I think the approach to young offenders is just far too damn soft. I'm not against rehabilitation. I'm not against tackling the root causes. But you cannot have a situation where people are terrorising the public. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. That is what's happening. And they've got no fear of justice. Why? Because their age protects them. It's a disgrace. But then that actually taps into a deeper problem because no government, politicians, they want votes, right? So they will talk tough on this issue. But Keir Starmer worked as head of the CPS. He knows how the justice system works. He knows that ministers cannot criticise sentencing, because if they do, they'll be accused of interfering with the judiciary. And part of our democratic system is the judiciary is independent from government. And I understand that. I understand why it has to be that way. But any changes we see in the justice system, there were a few under the Tories for the positive. It's better than nothing, but it just isn't enough. I think one of the biggest problems is there is a disconnect between what the public wants and what the justice establishment comes out with. I think people see judges as distant. I think people see the sentencing council as distant. And I know that they have public consultation. It's not good enough, though, because if they're putting out public consultation, if their sentencing guidelines do not reflect that consultation, then it's just lip service. It's just, kind of say, oh, well, we do consult the public. But I really think the justice establishment, by which I'm talking the courts, judges, the sentencing council, the Court of Appeal, and yes, to some extent, legislators, I do think they are very, very out of touch with public opinion on this. And that is important because it gets into an issue of democracy. It actually infuriates me. But, people feel so utterly powerless about it. But I'm going to read out some bills this government's brought in, because some of them are certainly welcome and some of them relate to what I've just been talking about. It's just that I think no government, Starmer can talk tough, Cooper can talk tough, but whatever they try to pass in terms of legislation, ultimately the sentencing council passes the guidelines, and then judges have the discretion. So, it's a blame game, because when the public complain about soft sentencing, judges claim their hands are tied. The Sentencing Council says that they're simply issuing guidelines, and ministers will say we can't tell judges what to do. So it's a blame game. That's what's so infuriating about it. Now, anyway, bills. There's a lot here. 31. I'm not going to go through each and every single one, but I'm just going to pick some at random here, because it's been a busy government so far. The Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Bill, enabling the government to renationalise the railways. The Renters' Rights Bill, banning no-fault evictions and extending building safety requirements to the private sector. Reform of the House of Lords. Two separate bills to phase out the remaining hereditary peers in the House of Lords and to increase the number of female bishops in the House. Of course, many people believe the House of Lords should be abolished altogether. The Terrorism Protection of Premises Bill to require venues to establish procedures for dealing with terrorist threats, enacting Martin's Law. This is referring to one of the victims, I believe, of the Manchester bombing. The Victims' Courts and Public Protection Bill, requiring offenders to attend sentencing hearings and removing parental rights from convicted sex offenders. That's welcome, so it's not all bad. I think that when assessing any government, you have to look at the positive as well. Because that is one thing I find, that people can be too negative sometimes when they just make out sweeping statements. Let's see, the Tobacco and Vapes Bill to bring in a phased ban on smoking. That's essentially just continuing what Sunak started. Let's see, and there's numerous other ones. So 31 altogether in the King's Speech. The two-child benefit cap was controversial. Starmer and Reeves had refused to scrap the benefit cap introduced by the Cameron-Clegg coalition, citing financial reasons. The cap was introduced in 2013 as part of the coalition government's wide-reaching welfare reform agenda, which included the introduction of universal credit and reforms of housing benefit and disability benefits. Well, I've said before, that's quite a specific thing, but I'm just thinking of the welfare system more generally. I do not like the sanction culture, so I was very disappointed at that conference in Liverpool for Reeves to be basically doubling down on punishing claimants who abuse the system. I get it, there are people who abuse the system, but why make that a central focus? I think there's no difference with them and the Tories in this regard, or very little difference in terms of the language that's used. Like I said, there's a lot of things here. I'm not going to be able to cover everything. I'll wrap up the video with foreign policy, but before I get into that, my goodness, there's so many things. Immigration. The government's obviously abandoned the Rwanda scheme and instead introduced let me get the terminology right, the Border Security Command, introduced by Home Secretary Yvette Cooper to tackle the people smuggling gangs. Um, I also think, Labour MPs have written to the government to say that the optics of migrants going to hotels are not good. I don't actually think those people are living in luxury as people believe. However, the optics are not good when people are struggling, when we have, plenty of social problems of our own. It's that only galvanizes the far right. It gives them kind of something to beat. So I think that definitely needs to be evaluated, sending migrants to hotels. I think the hard left is extremely naive on this. They just want an open door policy, and so do, frankly, some charities where there's absolutely no limits whatsoever. That simply isn't realistic. No government in the world can sustain that. So any British government is going to be under pressure to reduce immigration numbers. Um, but I also think that sometimes there is too much negativity around immigration. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole thing about this because it's in itself it would be worth a whole video. But I think that the focus of immigration has to be: are people contributing to our society? Are they integrating? Those to me are the main things. I certainly don't think, as some Tories believe, it should just be financial assets, because you could have a Russian oligarch who's a billionaire, but if he's cozying up to Putin, is that really helping this country? I don't think so. Or, Saudis, who we've seen in the boxing world recently, how Saudis have been buying up that sport. I would argue a Filipino nurse or an Indian doctor is a better asset than some of those other examples. I also think that fundamentally, if you have couples that say one is British and the other is from another country, I think it's fundamentally cruel to divide them up, to make it really, really difficult to grant immigration rights, to grant visas and so on. And in terms of people who are coming here as asylum seekers, I think the system should be as straightforward as possible, because that's another side to it. People talk about the small boats, but it isn't necessarily straightforward to go down the legal route. Um, Having said that, it is not racist for people to voice concern about the numbers coming in. And for communities in Kent and Essex and Lincolnshire, they really are seeing this firsthand. They're seeing, migrants coming in en masse. I wouldn't use some of the language that some on the right use, like invasion and things like that, but it is a problem. It is a problem. We've got limited resources. We may be a major economy, but there are limited resources. So it isn't racist for the government to respond to this concern about lowering the numbers. In fact, it's extremely important for everyone's interest. I don't think there's any magic wand in this. It's a very difficult issue, but I do think that some of those on the left who think it should just be a case of letting everyone in, they're showing extreme naivety. So I certainly don't envy Yvette Cooper in dealing with this problem, because it is definitely one of the thorniest issues in government. Um, the early prisoner release scheme, like I say, Starmer himself was angry about prisoners celebrating, but what Labour has to do, what they have to do, I mentioned earlier that they have a contradictory position on crime and justice. Well, what they have to do is lay out what they're going to do to build more prison spaces, because they said they would do it during the campaign. And it isn't very reassuring when the prisons minister is saying we punish too many people. Now, there may be some people in prison who shouldn't be there. I don't think non-payment of the TV licence should be an imprisonable offence. I don't think drug possession for personal use should be an imprisonable offence. But frankly, there's young offenders who get away with crimes that frankly should be there in a young offenders institute, and they aren't. Um, I'd like to see Labour lay out a plan for building more prison spaces. You see, the issue to me isn't how many people are in prison, it's about what works, about keeping the public safe. If we have the biggest prison population in Europe, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I'd rather they were inside than outside terrorising the public. Of course, you need to look into the root causes. You need to look at rehabilitation. You need to look at all of that. But fundamentally, absolutely, people who hurt society have to pay a price. That's what justice is. And I think the Liberal left have long failed to grasp that. They've always seen punishment as punitive. It does serve a purpose, actually. Um, I'm not hopeful that anytime soon we're going to see a big change in terms of how young offenders are dealt with. I think, unfortunately, it will still be the softly, softly approach, despite what Starmer and Cooper say. So I'm not enthusiastic or optimistic about that. I'm going to wrap this up because I'm aware of the time. It's impossible to cover everything. But foreign policy. Now, on this area, I'm relatively pleased with the government so far. I think, again, particularly with Israel, the Palestinian issue, with the conflict in the Near East, I've said before, a bit like the BBC, the government is going to be damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. If it's too pro-Israel, then it's going to be attacked by a lot of its base, a bit like the Democrats in the United States are attacked by some of their base in that regard. Um, and yet, if they don't support Israel, then they're accused, absurdly in my opinion, of being pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah. I think it's a very difficult thing, and I think Starmer and Lamy have really tried to get it right on this now. That cancelling of the arms agreement, which amounted to a very small fraction, probably backfired because it didn't please anyone. For pro-Palestinians, it didn't go far enough, and for pro-Israelis, it was abandoning an ally when they're under attack on several fronts. I do believe, I'll reiterate this, it is absolutely legitimate for the British government to raise concerns about the civilian death toll. I absolutely believe it is legitimate for this government to ask what is happening with the weapons that we send to another country, even if it is an ally. And I reiterate that Israel is not above criticism. I think a lot of conservatives and a lot on the right and a lot of pro-Israelis essentially put out a narrative that Israel cannot be criticised. That, to me, is very wrong. But the other side, that this video is not about this subject, but I'm just touching on it. The other side do underestimate the situation Israel is in. They do underestimate that it's being attacked on several fronts at once. There is no quick fix to this problem. It is a very, very difficult situation. But I absolutely insist that the government can support Israel's right to defend itself whilst also raising concerns about the number of civilians who are being killed. And yes, when Israel crosses a line. The thing is, of course, that applies to Hamas and Hezbollah, who have committed crimes against humanity. But there is a difference. We're allied with Israel. We're not allied with Hamas and Hezbollah. So it's not really necessary for the government to have to prove that they're criticising them, because they're already on the government's list of terrorist organisations, whereas Israel is an ally. That's why it's a different thing, because it's more applicable to our relationship with Israel. But I do think critics of Israel need to look at the situation it's in, which is, many Israelis with some justification would say it's a fight for survival. But the number of civilian dead is horrendous. So I think the Labour Party is right to not just go along with everything Netanyahu says, and by all means we should listen to Israeli concerns, but I don't think it should be Netanyahu's demands, particularly given some of the people in his cabinet are far right ideologues who go well beyond just the defence of Israel. On Ukraine, I have no major criticisms. I think that Starmer has continued basically what we've seen with some consistency in this country. Sometimes foreign policy should be consistent. I think when it comes to Ukraine, there's no difference really between Starmer and Johnson, and that's a good thing, because Putin is banking on Western fatigue. Putin is banking on the West to give up. Keir Starmer, like Rishi Sunak, like Liz Truss, like Boris Johnson, has been resolutely supportive of Ukraine. I think that is a very important thing. We shouldn't give up, because Putin will be banking on this. Remember, the Second World War took 6 years. So far, this war is about 2.5 years. So we cannot allow Putin to think that we're just going to give up. Give him an inch, he takes a mile. In terms of the American election, I've just mentioned this very briefly. If Harris gets in, I don't think there's any major cause for concern. I think Harris and Starmer will get on very well. They come from a similar background. If Trump gets in, Lamy has said he'll be practical. They're going to have to work with Trump. He will be the president of the United States. But I don't think that means we therefore have to roll out the red carpet. We can work with him. America is one of our oldest allies. That isn't going to change because Trump's in the White House. But I don't think there should be any prerequisite for rolling out the red carpet, making him feel welcome. The man's a convicted criminal. He's a disgrace. I don't think that we should kind of say, oh, well, he's just another American president. Work with him by all means. But I know Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General, is taking that approach. He's downplaying Trump's rants about NATO. But basically, in foreign policy, I would give Starmer 6, 7 out of 10. I don't see any major controversies. And I think both Starmer and Lamy made strong speeches at the UN. They weren't mincing the words when it came to Russia. What I do want to see, and this is why I don't give them a higher mark, I want to see their approach to China. His respective governments have spoken about, standing up to China and taking a harder line, but it failed to really materialize. I think James Cleverly was too weak on China, too cautious. Dominic Raab, to be fair, was a bit more proactive. He summoned the Chinese ambassador when the Hong Kong stuff was going on. It remains to be seen what this government's approach to China is going to be. Criticising human rights is. We also need to see the security threats. I want to see the Starmer government close down Confucius Institutes. And basically, when the Chinese regime comes out with its jingoistic rants, I think we should push back a little bit. I think we should back allies that are being bullied by China. All of this whilst recognising that we can't totally divorce ourselves from the world's second biggest economy. And then we get into countries like India, Brazil, other major markets. All of these things require caution, but I think that Starmer needs to show he's patriotic. He needs to show that he will stand up for this country first and foremost. I like some of the things he's done as leader. He was very quick to act on the anti-Semitism problem. He was also the woke thing. Starmer himself has pandered to that, and I loathe wokeism. But I think as Prime Minister, he will be less woke because he knows that come the next election, he will have to keep the seats that he gained. Labour done very well in that election, but I do wonder, was that really Labour's success, or was it just that people were fed up with the Tories? Because how does that explain the rise of Reform and the rise of the Liberal Democrats? Anyway, I really will wrap this up. It's a very long video, but there was a lot to say. No doubt there'll be more to say, but we'll see how this government plays out. I suspect Starmer will be in power. I predict minimum of 4 years, maximum of 7. I don't think he'll be in as long as Blair, but I may be 71 if he does do that long. But Biden's 82 soon, so it isn't implausible. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. And Lord Palmerston was even older when he became Prime Minister. Okay, we'll wrap this up. Let me know your thoughts on the government.